It's an extremely good question whether or not the digital age has affected positively or negatively on children's brains. And as a father of 3 children now spread out between 20 and 10 years old, I think I'm and as a neurosurgeon, I think I'm reasonably well qualified to give my observations at least. There's no evidence, first of all, physically, there's no evidence that mobile phones per se cause brain damage, cause brain cancer. The type of radiation that's emitted by the digital devices has never been shown to cause tumour development in any organism or any animal. So the concept that it might cause brain cancers and so forth is completely false. And that's without question. The question about whether or not children's brains have been positively affected by digital devices, I think you'd have to say that children are incredibly better educated by the mobile phones than ever before, and certainly looking at what information is available to children and realising how much more developed they are at whatever age they are, because they've got access to so much more content. And that content, whether it be appropriate or not, certainly educates the children in a huge degree. So I think from an educational advanced perspective, I think they're far better educated, they're far more worldly, they've got access to far more information. I mean, in my days, our information about the world came from the World Book Encyclopedia, which didn't matter where you were, whatever edition you had. And I remember that was from the 70s and probably the early 80s. All the editions were well and truly out of date by the time they were published. So, we've got children who are now got real-time access to anything they want to, and they're quite happy to flick into it and chase information. So I think from a brain health and education that we've got children who are far more advanced. From a physical perspective, probably the only negative is, are children spending too much time on their devices, and are they physically suffering because they're not doing enough physical activity? And that, I tend to think, is probably the case. China has just announced restrictions on how long their children can be gaming for during the week, because they're concerned about their own children not being active enough to do exercise. And so instead of being outside and doing physical activity, they're indoors doing, let's call it mental activity by gaming for hours and hours at a time. And I think that can only be physically a negative, if it's done to an excessive degree. And where the precise amounts are of whether or not there should be a certain amount of screen time, that's not really probably my area of expertise. But I certainly am concerned that children would spend too long doing it if they weren't pushed in a certain way. And I think psychologically, I don't know at this stage, and I'm not really sure whether or not the psychology of being on games is going to have a detrimental effect. And one could argue that spending a lot of time on a game where it's just it's just the child and the screen, and they're not interacting with each other or different peers or different age groups, is that leading to deficiencies in their psychological upbringing and their ability to communicate and socially interact with one another? And I think there's 2 ways of looking at that. One is, yes, they probably are spending too long just in one interface and not communicating, but it seems to me that the information they get out of their screen is what they then go and communicate with each other. So trying to deprive them of that interaction when that is what they then talk about. I listen to my children talking about what they've seen on the screens. They're doing TikToks together. That's a physical action that they all do as a fun group. And I think probably overall the positives outweigh the negatives. That's my personal feeling. But I think the jury's still out on that. I think we've never had a generation of children spend so long with a personal screen. And one could say, well, look, 20 years ago, the previous generation was spending similar amounts of time sitting looking at a television screen. And whether or not it's any different and we're just looking at the updated version of it, I'm not sure. But certainly the amount and quality and variety of content is certainly making, I think, for much better educated and more advanced children.